Hello, welcome to the self learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 2 Constitutionalism BNA Act of 1867, Constitutional Act of 1982, Charter of Rights and Freedom. We start with topic British North America Act 1867. The BNA Act amalgamated the individual provinces into one country under a federal system. It set up a general government charged with matters of common interest to the whole country and local governments for each of the provinces charged with the control of local matters in their respective sections. Four provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, came together at the passing of the BNA Act in 1867. The Queen was given power on the advice of the Privy Council and on the address from Parliament of Canada and legislatures of Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and British Columbia to admit the remaining colonies or any of them into the Dominion, and with the same advice she was given power to admit Rupert's Land and Northwestern Territory. Under this process, the people of Red River, Manitoba, became part of Canada in 18. British Columbian 1860, 1871, and British Edward Island in 1873. Thus, Canada by 1873 consisted of these seven provinces together with Rupert's Land and Northwest Territories by 1905. The provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta was created, and in 1949 Newfoundland joined in as the 10th province of Canada. The BNA Act thus is the instrument that created the Dominion of Canada and provided for its structure of government. The Act included sections on the following: the formation of Canada, including the data and the names of the four original provinces, executive power with reference to the Governor General and Privy Council, but no mention of a cabinet or a prime minister, legislative power, including the creation, constitution, and powers of the Senate and the House of Commons. The House of Commons had representations by population, with Quebec as the pivotal province. It would have same 65 seats it had in the United Province of Canada, and the others would have more or less depending on their relative population. Provincial constitutions with definitions of their executive and legislative powers, distribution of powers between the provinces and the federal government, judicature, the legal system. It may also be pointed out that while the 1867 agreement created a highly centralized federation, parts of the agreement specifically recognized Quebec's distinctiveness in the tradition of the 1774 Quebec Act, including the official status of French in Quebec and the protection of the province's civil law. It recognized Quebec's civil code as distinct from the English common law in effect in other provinces and provided for the use of England and French in Parliament and the Quebec legislature and courts, and for the publicity funded separate schools for Protestant and Catholic minorities in Quebec and Ontario, and later in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Now let us discuss the point towards patriation. As mentioned above, the British North American Act was an act of the British Parliament and was amendable in the same manner as all other British acts and statutes. Of course, this formal authority of the British Parliament was ruled by conventions of the Constitution, which made the British Parliament essentially an instrument of Canadian will, that is, the amending on request from Canada. Seen in this context, the BNA Act can also be termed as the first steps towards independence of Canada. Nevertheless, the fact is that the Canada was a dominion of Britain with formal powers to amend the constitution with the British Parliament and the Technical Committee of the Privacy Council of Great Britain as the court of final appeal for Canada. Canada gradually was allowed to assume more autonomy over its own affairs. Tracing the history of reputation, Sir Nanian Stephen points out that in 1926 the Balfour Report signaled the impending advent of British Commonwealth of Nations and with it Canada's equal and independent status. Accordingly, beginning in the 1927, discussions were held about patriating Canada's constitution, transferring the amending authority from the British Parliament to Canada, but the provinces and the federal government could not agree on constitutional amending procedures. Consequently, when Canada officially ceased to be a British colony with passage of the Statutes of Westminster in 1931, the authority to amend the constitution remained with the British Parliament. In 1949, the Canadian Parliament was given a limited amending power in areas that did not concern provincial jurisdiction. Discussions and demands for patriation, however, continued. Prior to 1968, discussions on the amending formula were always held on their own merit in 1927, 1931, 1935, and 1936, 1950, 1960, 61, and 1964, without being linked to other questions of substantive changes. Ultimately, these discussions all ended in failure. In 1968, the Prime Minister and all the premiers agreed to launch for the first time in Canada's history a broad constitutional renewal process that included not only patriation and an amending formula but also changes to national institutions and the distribution of powers as well as the entrenchment of rights in the constitution. Agreement in principle was reached on a limited set of proposals at the Victoria Conference in 1971. but ultimately they were not adopted, and the constitution remained a British status. A more limited exercise conducted in 1975-76 was aimed at patriation with an amending formula without pursuing substantive changes in the constitution at the same time. However, this also ended in failure. Although Quebec has been calling for increased provincial powers for years, the election of Parti Québécois in 1976 on a platform calling for a dramatic distancing of Quebec from the rest of the Canadian Federation made constitutional renewal seem all the more pressing. The federal government responded for publishing its vision of constitutional renewal in A Time for Action in June 1978. Between October 1978 and February 1979, governments worked intensively on a 12-item agenda for constitutional change, but the February Conference of First Ministers ended in failure to reach agreement on any change. In late 1979, the Parti Québécois government released a paper on Canadian federalism that called for a radical recasting of the Quebec-Canada relationship. The paper did not advocate Quebec's complete institutional withdrawal from Canada, but rather called for the creation of a very loose partnership between Quebec and Ottawa called Sovereignty Association. A referendum to seek a mandate to negotiate such an arrangement was set for May 20, 1980. On May 14, the Prime Minister of Canada promised Quebecers a renewed federalism if they voted no in the impending referendum. The referendum and the pledge of the Prime Minister and the majority of the other premiers during the referendum campaign heralded the start of a new vigorous effort to patriate the Constitution. The summer witnessed a series of federal provincial ministerial meetings, which culminated in the First Ministers' Conference of September 1980. The First Ministers, however, failed to reach unanimous agreement on any single item. Consequently, on October 6, 1980, the federal government indicated that it intended to patriate the Constitution unilaterally without the consent of the provincial premiers by introducing a joint address to the Queen in the House of Commons. 8 of the provinces immediately protested this unilateral action. Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland referred the matter to their courts, and the matter was ultimately referred to the Supreme Court of Canada by the federal government. On September 28, 1981, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered its decision that a unilateral patriation of the Constitution was legal, but it added that the substantial degree of provincial consent was required by constitutional convention before the federal provincial relationship could be fundamentally altered by a request to Britain for constitutional amendment. In the wake of the court of decision, the federal government convened another First Ministers' Conference on November 2, 1981. Here, Ottawa and the provinces, with the exception of Quebec, ultimately agreed on a package of constitutional reforms, including the patriation of the Constitution with an amending formula and a Charter of Rights, a commitment of equalization, the strengthening of provincial control over natural resources, and the recognition and affirmation of the existing rights of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. The agreement represented a compromise between 9 provinces and the federal government. These provinces accepted Ottawa's proposal for a Charter of Rights in exchange for both the rights to override certain portions of the Charter by means of the notwithstanding clause and the inclusion of an amending formula devised by the provinces. However, the Quebec government continued to dissent, arguing that the Quebec's claim had been ignored, that a deal had been reached without Quebec's knowledge, and that the Prime Minister had nudged on his promise of renewed federalism. On December 1, 1981, by resolution, the National Assembly rejected the patriation package. Indeed, throughout Quebec, the patriation experience left many feeling wounded and isolated. The Constitution was patriated on 17th April 1982 without the consent of the Quebec legislature, but the Supreme Court of Canada subsequently ruled that the patriation process had respected Canada's laws and conventions and that the Constitution, including the Constitution Act of 1982, was in force throughout Canada. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.